Okay, hello again. I think it's still me in the room, so I'm just recording. So I hope you've just had a bit of a break after that presentation. And I like this new slide thing that I've got. So they both look similar with the leafy things on. So yeah, it's a different presentation. I thought I'd get through this one as well. And then next week we can look at the assessment of you on practicum, those assessment forms, and a student asked about that this week, so we'll do that next week. We'll look at your assessment and we'll look at prac things, and I'll have a look at what we haven't covered yet in terms of the modules 1, 2 and 3. So we'll probably be moving on to module 3, and so I'll just be making sure that I haven't left anything out. So I've got the recording on. Yes, let's go forward now. So we looked at taxonomy and organization of the bigger layers around things that we do and how things get done and how things are valued and quality is considered. And part of all of that cycle, we've noted that observations, especially in assessment of what children are learning and the decisions we make around those observations are very important. So we're going to have a look at observations in early childhood. I have sent you a couple of chapters which I apologize weren't very well copied, and I just sent you those, so just make sure that you turn the view around, rotate them so you can see them properly. But I based this PowerPoint really as a presentation of those readings. So what we're going to be doing is having a look at those readings through this presentation. So for many decades, observation, well, since right back to Froebel, theory and practice has said that observations of children is very important, that we need to always observe before we plan for children. So that's not new. But we've got a much more comprehensive way of looking at things now through the early years learning framework and the connectedness of children to those wider layers of Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory layers, that they're connected to family and community and culture, and that all of that matters. They're not just individuals without connections to their wider social world. So observation has changed in our approaches to it. So the role of observation in early childhood settings. Observation across disciplines has been used. We've seen it in sociological studies, anthropological, psychological, historical, and education perspectives. It's been long used. So, and now in many other areas of disciplines, it's used as well. Okay, so theorists have used observation to develop their knowledge. As I said, mentioned Froebel earlier. He's one of the earliest European theorists, anyway, that talked. He was around in the 18th and into the 19th century, and he well, his work underpinned kindergartens, and we still use the word kindergarten and kindy, and that all came out of Froebel's original theoretical ideas. So he believed that teachers should have an in-depth knowledge of children's play in order to understand how they learn. And he saying these things way back when our ideas about children and the construction of childhood looked quite different. Back then, we didn't have institutionalized schooling systems. That many children of 3 years old, as young as 3 years old, were living and dying and working and dying down mine shafts. So in some of the European countries. So, he was around at a time where he was really forging for the human rights of children and that there actually is a childhood. So the topic of the construction of childhood is a contentious one around the world. So Froebel was really a forerunner. He's a very interesting theorist that really is a forefather for much of the direction that early childhood's gone into. Maria Montessori was another theorist who goes right into the 20th century, sorry. She was a doctor, she studied physiology, she worked in Italy in a lot of the industrial areas where she observed children parents working in factories, and she started up creches and things at the side of factories. She created small furniture that fitted children's smaller physiques better. So she had a huge influence, apart from her structured materials, play-based materials, and schooling systems that we see here and around the world, Montessori schooling, and teachers educated in a Montessori approach to things. And you see Montessori schools in very poor areas of places like India and very wealthy areas of places like Brisbane. So yeah, so Montessori has been a big influence. Malaguzzi, who's the founder of the Reggio Emilia movement, which is huge in Australia. There's a professional called Rinaldi who works in South Australia and writes. So Rinaldi, if you look up her work in Reggio Emilia, she talks about it in the Australian context, and her work's very accessible. And she's often at the conferences, the early childhood conferences. So Reggio Emilia approach is very much an understanding of a child within their community setting. You can see the words like curiosity, interest, and confidence, the dispositions that we talked about earlier that resonate across the work of Reggio Emilia as a child reflects on their own understanding of meaning of what they've learned. And some childcare centres, like the one on campus in Kelvin Grove in Queensland University of Technology, are purpose-built Reggio Emilia buildings where children, I think not the babies, but the children can roam around and spend time in the kitchen with the cook helping prepare the food, or go into the art room and create art. So they sort of move freely around sort of a larger house kind of setting of indoor and outdoor approaches, which is a Reggio Emilia approach. So many theorists have used observations in the time. John Dewey, who was a progressive reformer earlier in the 21st century, observation alone was not enough and that assessment should be included, and Dewey had a huge influence on the schooling system and the institutionalizing of schooling. Dewey believed that assessment should be done through reporting what children can and cannot do. So we've had a big influence from Dewey. Formative assessment and summative assessment of children. Those two words are very familiar in the educational setting. So in the Burke textbook, which you will have because it's the textbook for this unit and you'll use it across other units, on one of the pages, I think the 9th edition, it's on page 32, there's a table that sort of sums up theorists and their ideas about development and learning and the course of development and the way they think about it. So that sort of summarizes, you can read in that chapter, but it summarizes the theorists for you. So have a look at that. So we're going to look at types of observations from the material, the resources that I sent you. Unstructured observations where you're a participant, structured observations of non-participants, and semi-structured observations. So unstructured observations, oops, get rid of that. Description involving normal daily life as we see in children's services, in group settings. Normally the observer belongs to the group as the educator, naturalist in the sense that they are observed as it occurs in the sandpit or wherever it is. And the purpose is to capture the children of what they do on a daily basis. And if you have a look at some of the learning stories, you can see that they're absolutely founded upon observations and analysis of those observations to collect evidence, to provide evidence for information. So very important. So semi-structured observations, the observer has more clear aims and objectives. The approaches are open as the events are captured. And the purpose in this case is to capture the event that cannot be predicted. So to ascertain why behaviors are occurring. So we might do, if we're doing an observation of a child's social behavior, we might do a sociogram of who they play with, where they move around in a certain time frame, and if they interact with other children or not, and what materials they might interact with, for example. So, more structured observations, clear focus on exact events, behaviors and activities are specific techniques that are used to focus based on rigor. So, and other structured techniques that are used that we see a lot of in early childhood and in schooling, anecdotal running records, numeric scales, checklists, sampling, diagrammatic. So the purposes would be to written descriptions of brief narratives in the case of anecdotal. Very common in early childhood, sorry about the typo here, and capturing a variety of international of information formally, often associated with assessment. So things like checklists, numerical scales, sampling. When you go to preschool on your prac, you hopefully get to look at, confidentially, get to look at some of the children's portfolios with your mentor teacher. And you can see what sampling they have in them and what kinds of observations have been done. A lot of it's done as photographs and videos at the moment. And then that's analysed and written about. So collect information on your practicum about how these observations are done. Collect some samples, create a format to collect observations, which you'll get organised before prac. We'll talk more about what you need to organise next week. Consider what information is needed for the purpose of your observation and what it's going to be used for. So observations are embedded in the cycle in the early years learning framework, in the early childhood teachers and teaching and learning and practices. So it's embedded through there. And when you look at the learning stories section that I spoke of earlier, you'll see, and the cycle that we looked at last week, it's continually embedded in all of your thinking around each individual child and their learning and development. You can see it in the NT preschool curriculum, which you can access online. That's quite a useful document, even if you're not in the NT, because it's very explicit. It's a very explicit way of using the early years learning framework. And this again refers to the same cycle that we looked at last week and the one that we looked at earlier. It's the same cycle of reflection, data, analysis, planning, and acting and doing, and then back to reflection again. That one was just taken from the preschool curriculum. Observing for development. We're going to be looking at domains of development now. We touched on development, and you've got your textbook which focuses on development, and your second prac will focus exclusively on development. Physical and biological development, personal, social, and emotional development, cognitive development, which is certainly very important in some of the key learning areas like mathematics that I talked about in the earlier presentation. Language development and creativity. Creativity is very important for human beings. So we need to make sure we always keep creativity in the frame. And I think creativity is something we do very well in early childhood. So physical and biological development. So we have large motor and small motor, which used to be referred to as gross motor and fine motor, but we now refer to it as large and small. So balancing, walking, running, jumping and climbing. So when the children are in the outdoor program especially, we might be observing or setting up specifically for certain aspects of physical development. And small motor development, hand preferences. Children, you can see quite early in life what children's hand preferences are. Children holding objects, turns with hands, dresses and undresses themselves, makes puzzles and builds with small blocks. So you can see the dexterity, you can see the fine motor skills in terms of their working towards independence and regulating themselves. So personal, social and emotional developments. Emotional development are tied in with all kinds of behaviors that children experience throughout the day and in their lives generally. I mean, hopefully they don't experience some of the more difficult emotions like fear and anger and sadness and distress too often, but in their lives they do experience these at some point. And we need to be aware of those situations and how to work with those children. So well-being and emotional well-being is part of our work, and how we present things, materials, how we build relationships with children, and how we include and allow, shouldn't say allow, how we ensure a sense of belonging for all of those children. So emotional well-being is really an underpinning of the early years learning framework as well. So personal development stays settled, makes eye contact, develops relationships, participates in role play, symbolic play and social play, and gets involved. So that's quite an important part of personal development, and regulating behavior as well, regulating their own behavior. So social development, engaging in watching others during activities, playing with themselves, parallel play, play with others, making friends, having friends, keeping friends, following rules. We always have some rules within the preschool, nice and simply put, so children would be able to follow rules like, putting a hat on when you go outside to play. Sharing things with others in terms of resourcing, seeing things with another point of view, and helping others during play. Now, some children, you can't expect that they would have all of these, so we have to work towards children being more social, taking turns, sharing with others. We have a lot of children that don't have siblings, for example, that might need a bit more help in this area. Might have children who are new arrivals who don't speak English, which means their communication in terms of making friends and following rules and everything really would be quite challenging. Cognitive development, children's concentration, distraction, recognizing familiar objects and people, can name familiar objects. Well, this is impacted by language as well. Research searches for hidden favorite items and objects. Perception, identifying objects and attributes, locating, positioning. So you can see this relates very strongly to the mathematics and literacy as well. Recognizing patterns, reasoning and problem solving, sorting and classification. So you can see, well, in the previous presentation I referred to mathematics. It's linked very closely with cognitive development. So language development, single words, sentences, conversations, where children are at with their language. They can narrate stories. You can see emergent literacy, you can observe that. They can engage in pretend writing, pretend reading, attempts at scribbling, letter-like writing, reads pictures, holds books, knows about books conventions, points to text, turns pages and understands print, conveys meaning. So creativity, makes marks on paper, makes shapes, shows an interest in drawing, shows an interest in singing, dramatic play, story making, storytelling, and combines materials and objects to create. So as educators, we enhance the environment. We make sure that the environment is set up in a way that enhances children's engagement with creativity. For example, in the centre at QUT that's built, purpose-built for Reggio Emilia, There's an art room, so the educator is based in that room, and the children come in and out of the room and engage with that educator or the other peers that are in that room, and then they interact with the materials and they become creative. They start to, and they choose to come and be creative in that moment, and the educator guides them and enables their creative work and creative learning and development. So that's how it works with Reggio Emilia. So some references for this presentation. Your Burke text, of course, the Early Years Learning Framework, and the resources that I sent you earlier. And before next week, I will make sure you've got the Arthur and the car reading available to you as well, for the dispositions and the chapter 3 that I referred to earlier on. Okay, well, I won't ask for any questions because I'm the only one in the room, but thank you if you've listened to this all the way through. And next session in week 5, we'll be looking at your assessment forms for PRAC, talking a bit more about PRAC things, preparation, and by the final week, we'll talk about things that you need to be organised with. And I'll also include some content material from Module 3 or whatever we haven't covered yet. So thank you very much for your time. This session is about an hour and 24 minutes in the end. Okay, thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed listening when you do tune in and catch up with the recording. Thank you very much.